Welcome to the Screener College Basketball Podcast with your hosts, Mike Randle and Gus Kearns.
We need to get back to some sort of normalcy. All of us here who are struggling with the COVID-19 outbreak, we are struggling for some sort of normal, some sort of regular experience, especially for us sports fans, and in particular us college basketball fans who right now should be talking about March Madness, who right now should be recapping how the first weekend went down of March Madness and getting ready for the Sweet 16. Just an amazing Thursday and Friday, one of the best 2 days of the entire sports calendar. But instead, we're quarantined, we're inside, we're limited, we're worried about the virus. It's time to get some sort of normalcy back. So what we're doing here on the Screener College Basketball Podcast is we are going to take you to different teams, different college basketball teams, and talk to the beat reporters. We have a relationship with them. You've heard us talk to them on the team preview series. And now we're going to bring the top ones back to talk about their teams. Review the season, talk about who's leaving, who can be returning, and give us a preview of next year. A little taste into the college basketball life that we crave right now, a little normalcy. And we're going to start with the Michigan State Spartans, the team that was the number one preseason college basketball team in America. And it was a roller coaster ride certainly this year, with Josh Langford, who was supposed to be back and be their top scorer. And then he was ruled out with the injury and out for the rest of the year, and his future is unknown. And then the tragedy of the passing of Cassius Winston's brother, and how that affected the Michigan State community, and how the team rallied around Cassius Winston to come together for him and support him. Then the Michigan State basketball program on the court, where they went into Illinois facing possibly a 4-game losing streak, but pulled out what I think was a tipping point win. And we will talk today to Chris Solari of the Detroit Free Press about that win, about this team, about the Spartans, and how that signified a turning point for them and how they were playing their best basketball, as they usually do with Tom Izzo as the head coach, at the end of the season. Chris is an expert on all things Michigan State. He covers basketball, football, and to show you how locked in he is, he talks in this interview about why Xavier Tillman should declare for the NBA draft, everything about his great achievements on the court, his personal things off the court, and sure enough, right after we recorded this yesterday, Xavier Tillman declared for the NBA draft. So great job by Chris. He's a fantastic follow on Twitter at Chris Solari, Chris Solari. Fantastic follow, Michigan State. We're going to give you insight, get you out of the quarantine, get your mind back into sports. Let's talk some college hoops and Spartan basketball with Chris Solari. It is a pleasure to have Chris Solari from the Detroit Free Press with us today. A must follow, one of my favorite follows on Twitter at Chris Solari, Solari. He joins us today in the Screener College Basketball Podcast to review the Michigan State Spartan season, which, folks, was certainly headed towards another fantastic finish. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today. How you doing, man? Everybody doing well by you?
Yeah, doing well here. My family's kind of perplexed a little bit of why I'm around in March. It seems like everybody's kind of like, wait a minute, this is the time you're supposed to be away. I'm like, yeah, that kind of is how everybody's families are feeling right now that cover tournament teams every year. And boy, it's interesting times. That's probably the easiest way and most understated way I could say it.
It's totally true. And listen, it's hopefully we can provide some excitement here and a distraction to folks to talk some college basketball, because we should be knee deep in the tournament. That's for sure. Let's talk about the season. You know, the early season losses in a big matchup, a close loss, is sort of something that Tom Izzo doesn't mind. He always wants to challenge his team, legendary non-conference schedules, which is why they always peak at the end of the season just at the right time. Last time they really rattled off, though, an undefeated start, I went back, was 2015-2016 when they started 13-0. So the last few seasons, there have been some early, close, tough losses. 2016-2017 lost to Arizona and Kentucky. 2017-2018, they lost to Duke and Chicago. 2018-2019, they lost to Kansas. But, of course, last year ended with that trip to the Final Four. Izzo's 8th in 25 years. Just absolutely crazy. So when they lost to Kentucky 69-62 this year, what was your feeling around the team? You know, the Michigan State came in, number one team in the country. Of course, the issues with Josh Langford, of course, which is really frustrating and sad for him. But what was the feeling after that start? Was it like, listen, no problem, we'll get it going. Kentucky is good, and we'll be ready at the end of the season? What were the thoughts there as the season, tipped off without Langford?
I think the first thought was, how do they replace Langford? Because that game against Kentucky, I mean, all eyes were on Cassius Winston, and they had no secondary scoring in that game. And that was probably one of Xavier Tillman's worst offensive games of the season. So you didn't even have the second scoring option at that point. Gabe Brown was firing up threes off the bench, and he hit 2, but they struggled to shoot outside. They struggled with the size and length of Kentucky because they didn't have Aaron Henry kind of playing to the level that he played at the end of last season. And they were still a work in progress trying to figure out Rocket Watts. He got thrust into the starting lineup when ideally they could have used him as kind of a 1-2 backup to spell both Langford and Winston. But instead, he had to take the bulk of those early minutes. And, coming out of that game, I think you saw, it was a 69-62 game. Maxey just went off. I mean, he hit, and they were right there. They were right there in the Garden, close down the stretch. So, you thought, well, this wouldn't be a big deal. They've got some things to build on there, and there's some things that they had to replace with Kenny Goins and Matt McQuaid. And then they go to Maui and lose to Virginia Tech. And then that's kind of where you're like, uh-oh, a little bit. But at the same point, that Cassius Winston situation after the Kentucky game really changed the dynamic of the entire season when he lost his brother to a suicide. And that was on November 9th, I believe, November 8th or November 9th. And that was after the Kentucky game, but before the second game of the season against Binghamton. And, that became the prevailing and dominating theme of the season from that point on.
Yeah, Winston, of course, that was such a tragedy. The Michigan State has gone through so much recently. That is just a true tragedy with Winston, of course. And, not having Langford, it was an interesting start to the year because people still had them as number one. Then Langford there. Then, of course, the passing of Winston's brother, which was tragic. After the Maui experience, then when they played Virginia Tech, Hokies shot a blistering 10 of 21 from three. They're 48%. So it's just one of those games, right, where Virginia Tech, you tip your hat and then you move on. And then you get that Big Ten ACC Challenge game. Now, listen, the narrative that's been put out there in social media that Izzo struggles against Coach K. But then last year, of course, the massive win in the Elite Eight, beating Duke, advancing to their 8th Final Four. But then after that game, sort of must have made people really question it because Duke dominated really 45-29 at halftime en route to the victory. They lost to Stephen F. Austin 2 games earlier. There was no Cassius Stanley in that game. And Vernon Carey really did a great job inside, which of course against Michigan State is rare. So after that game, what were the thoughts there with Duke? Because I think that was kind of like, listen, Michigan State's going to get back on track. And then Duke came in and pretty much had a dominant performance.
Yeah, and the backstory in that is really what tells the story of that game. I mean, you mentioned about no Cassius and what people didn't know at the time and what people didn't know until a day or a couple days later is that when Winston got out in the court, he looked up in the stands and his mom wasn't there. And that is a very close-knit family. That is a family that, talks and communicates all the time, which makes the death of his brother that much harder because he's there with his mother, who with his mother and father who had a place in East Lansing and would stay there to escape their home in Detroit, just to keep their mind occupied and be around Cassius. And then when his mother wasn't there, there was all sorts of panic that went into his head that he didn't know where she was, and she just couldn't be there. She just mentally could not be around the people, around that environment at that point. And it rubbed off on Cassius Winston. Once you heard that story, once you understood that, that game became less of an impact game in the season, I think. In the moment of the game, you're kind of like, boy, Winston's just out of sorts. And we saw that at Maui in that first game. I mean, after the game, he talked about crying. And, Tom Izzo said that one of the players found him, Rocket Watts found him on a bench in the locker room at Lahaina Civic Center with basically almost a puddle of tears under his chair. Under the bench. I mean, that was kind of the ebb and flow, and that was kind of where you started, at least from our end, and I think from the general public, started to understand that this was going to be how Cassius Winston was going to be how the season would go, and that was always going to be the case. But you just didn't. This wasn't the steady player from a year ago. This was a guy who was grieving and still is grieving. I mean, I don't want to discount that, because I think that, he got wrapped up in the season and some distance got a little bit in there with time, that he was able to put it behind him for a bit. But I don't think that he was ever the same player that you saw in that Duke game a year ago, where he ran out the clock and just looked magnificent against that team and really willed Michigan State into that Final Four. He was never that player consistently. There were flashes, and that's why I think down the stretch you saw them win those 5 games in a row, and I think 6 of their last 7, and 5 of those games were against ranked teams. A couple road games at Illinois and Maryland. You started to see him round into himself again to be able to put some of that behind him. And I don't think he ever will be able to fully put that behind him. But at that moment, he was living in the present and saw just how much there could be for this team and kind of pulled himself back to be their leader.
And they rallied around him. He is a special all-time player. I mean, just the centerpiece, the heart and soul of the team, and the best player. They went on quite a run. After that Duke game, they won 9 out of 10, convincing wins over Illinois, Michigan, and a hot Minnesota team at the time that was really playing well. That's when I think Tillman, Henry, and Gabe Brown started to get going. And for me, Chris, the tipping point was the win at Illinois, because they were facing a 4-game losing streak, which does not happen under a Hall of Fame coach like Tom Izzo. Rocket Watts had what I think was his best all-around game at Illinois, 21 points, 2 of 4 from 3. That was massively important, because there were times when Michigan State was clicking early and the game was over. This was one of them. Cassius Winston gets that 4th foul, 10 minutes left. They're up 56-43. Illinois comes back, takes the lead 61-60, and then Winston just took over down the stretch. So I know they lost to Maryland after that, but to me, that was the critical game, sort of the tipping point of the season.
Absolutely. And I'm totally with you, because a lot of people thought that it was, maybe the Iowa game, but I thought it was the Illinois game, because that's been a tough environment for them to play in and win in with Winston at the point. I mean, all the way back to when Miles Bridges was there, and when they had Jaren Jackson that second year, they struggled at Illinois. Brad Underwood's system gives them trouble. That building gives them trouble. And you saw that Illinois is never out of it in those games. And I think, you saw at the end, the Dosunmu injury kind of scared anybody for a hot second at the end of that game. But the way that Winston got aggressive down the stretch, and he knew that he was going to have the attention. I think this is the kind of build from that Kentucky game to the Illinois game. He knew that he would draw 2-3 defenders. And on that last drive to the basket, he wasn't looking to shoot. He was looking to throw it off the glass.
Yes,
and
100%.
Get Tillman on the cut.
Yep.
And I mean, I just watched that play back again, and that's a masterful basketball play that only 2 guys who have repped that a lot, and a heady player. I mean, Tillman gets a lot of credit for how versatile he is as a player, but he's a smart player too. Just like Winston. I mean, they are 2 peas in a pod with their basketball IQ. And, he knew that Winston would be expecting him to crash, and he saw the defense go that direction. I mean, those 2 guys had done that a number of times over the last 2 years. I was watching back some games from last season where, Winston's getting some attention and just flings it over his shoulder to Tillman on the cut. I mean, that pick and roll became such bread and butter, but that one in particular, throwing it off the glass and Tillman getting it, I mean, that was it. I mean, that was Tillman at that point, he was waiting on the birth of his second child. He was struggling to finish around the rim, in large part in that 3-game losing stretch because he was not going to the basket hard. He was trying to lay things in and finesse things and missing over and over again. And the thing that was missing was exactly what you saw there on that play, an aggressive attack to try and destroy a rim. And once that happened, once he had his son, that came to fruition down the stretch. So as much as Winston lifted them, that play in particular lifted Tillman to get to that point where he was getting aggressive again and put all the mid-season, I don't even know what you want to call them, the yips. He had the yips basically around the rim. He put those aside, and that's when this team really took off.
Yeah, and anyone who knows how Cassius Winston shoots, that was not a shot. I watched it over and over again because I saw it initially and I said, was that a pass? And it was, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's, it's funny. Full disclosure, Chris, talked about this on the Action Network pod. We're talking about the teams, and I'm a huge Michigan State backer. I believe in them. I believe in them when the chips are down, when they're playing, when things weren't going well. But I even started to doubt them at some point. And it really is amazing. The supporting cast, it really came forward and just peaked at the right time. I remember saying, mid-year when they were having that losing streak, I'm like, guys, maybe this team isn't what we thought they were. Maybe Rocket Watts and Xavier Tillman and these guys just aren't at that level. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the year, they bang out the big wins over Iowa, Maryland, Penn State, which they dominated, Ohio State, of course. And then it became, oh, look at their supporting cast. They have Xavier Tillman. They have Rocket Watts. They have all these guys, Gabe Brown, who are playing so well. That supporting cast really came on right when the season ended.
Aaron Henry in particular.
Yep.
I think Aaron Henry, that was the guy all season that Tom Izzo, he loves the Batman analogy. I'm not really sure why, but he's always said, Batman, you got to have the Batman, you got to have the Robin, you got to have the Butler.
Yeah.
Well, we've never figured out. We spent a whole year trying to figure out who was who in that. Obviously, Cassius Winston was Batman, and I believe he thought Xavier Tillman was his Robin, even though sometimes you'd see Xavier Tillman and be the best player in the gym on some given nights this year, and rightfully so. I mean, not even just because of Cassius Winston's up and down nature, but just because Tillman had progressed so much, particularly on the defensive end. I mean, you look at those last few games. I mean, Luka Garza, Stick Smith, Mars Stevens, Caleb Wesson, he shut those guys down those last 4 games. That's why he got Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. I know Izzo did some lobbying for that, but when you have a stretch run like that, when you're playing that quality of competition in the post, and you lock them up for 4 straight games, I mean, that was impressive. And he was able to do it at both ends of the court, too, on the offensive side as well. But Aaron Henry, to me, though, as much as Tillman was kind of the consistent glue, Henry needed to kind of take that step forward to be the Butler or Catwoman or whoever, Alfred. I mean, Alfred is the Butler. I don't know why you didn't just say Alfred. But Henry started to score consistently. He started to attack the lane and look to distribute, because when Michigan State was good last year, when they started to make that run down the stretch, Aaron Henry it was the same situation where Joshua Langford goes out in December, Henry gets thrust into the lineup, finally starts to get comfortable, and he's attacking the middle of defenses and getting guys to collapse and setting up McQuaid and Goins and Winston for those outside shots. You started to see that opened things up for Rocket Watts, and he started to understand better shot selection. Gabe Brown, I think, had some ups and downs. In the mid part of the season, he was pretty good, and then he kind of had some struggles with confidence down the stretch, but he showed in those last couple games that he was starting to get ground the corner and start to attack the rim and get in the lane and not just settle for jump shots. And Malik Hall, I think Malik Hall was the other guy. Well, I shouldn't say the other guy. Malik Hall and Kyle Arns were the 2 other guys that really, Malik Hall flipped a switch from a freshman to a sophomore where things started to matter and you could see a level of intensity. And Kyle Arns is a senior, putting aside all the injuries, they needed that senior presence. When he started to come back from his, I think it was an Achilles on that foot that he really hurt in the Big Ten championship game out in Chicago against Michigan that cost him the NCAA tournament run. He put all caution aside and said, I'm playing. And when they started playing him 15 minutes a game, you saw the rest of that defense kind of come together around him. Guys started to know their roles. He's just, when you talk about the quintessential glue guy for that unit, he was kind of an amalgam of what Matt McQuaid and Kenny Goins provided last year, all in one package. And they really, at that point, when they beat Ohio State to close out the regular season, Arns and Winston have their senior day moments and kiss the Spartan helmet and walk off. You look at this team and you say, this team looks exactly where they want to be and exactly where Tom Izzo has had some of his best teams over the past 2 decades, 25 years. They were ready to make that run.
Yeah, and very true about all that. Arns coming back changed everything. He is the quintessential glue guy. You mentioned Aaron Henry. 4 of the last 5 games for the Spartans, at least 12 points or more, had 17 against Iowa in that big game. Chris, you talked about the kissing of the floor. That seemed to get Ohio State and Chris Holtmann a little upset.
Yeah.
They've been doing that for years. As a guy who's out here in New Jersey, I don't know why that was such a big deal. They've always done that.
Yeah, my buddy Larry Lage was down at the other end of the court, and he worked for the Associated Press. He heard him. I mean, that's how perturbed he was. And I think that Chris Holtmann kind of, after the heat of the moment, kind of wore away. He was kind of like, okay. But I also think that they maybe dragged that one out a little bit. But I think in large part that was because of Cassius Winston and because of what Cassius Winston meant to that community. I mean, Tom Izzo, the last couple of days and couple of weeks since all this went down with the season being canceled, I mean, he's pointing back to that moment and senior day and how nobody left. I mean, usually you'll have, half the people stay or, a good chunk. This is everybody. Nobody left their seats because they saw what that kid went through, Cassius Winston. They saw what his family did. And then to see them out there on senior day and the fans, the other parents, the other students, they fully embraced that entire family. And it was, that's a moment that kid's never going to forget. And it's the last moment he has as a college player now.
Yeah, I totally agree. Holtmann got upset. I have no idea why. It's a special moment, especially with everything that Winston has gone through and the season. Well, they were peaking, Chris, that's for sure. But of course, now we're going to look forward to next year. Some of the way too early, top 25 have Michigan State really dropping a little bit, sort of towards the back of the top 25. What are your thoughts on the players who are going to turn pro? I think Cassius Winston's going to be a fine pro. I think the lack of quote-unquote athleticism is overplayed. Players like Josh Hart, who maybe didn't have a position but were a huge impact player in college, are finding success in the NBA. So certainly I think Cassius Winston's going to. Who are you hearing that is also going to go and coming back next year as the Spartans look to reload here and go at it again?
Yeah, with Winston, I actually happened to run into an NBA scout in an airport this season randomly, and we didn't know each other's profession and started talking. And, he when we finally realized, oh yeah. So he had some good things to say and thinks that he could have a good longevity as a backup point guard at minimum. Just because of his feel for the game. And he thinks that, shorter bursts will, instead of those 30 plus minutes a game, might actually accentuate what he does at that next level. But I think that, if you look at what the situation that Xavier Tillman's in, he's 21 years old. He's married. He's got 2 children now under the age of 4. You just look at that and you think, and he's getting a mid to late first round grade at this point. He comes off a Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year. I don't think you can look at that and just say he's going to stay for another year. I think he's going to be gone. I think it'll probably be a situation where maybe he doesn't sign with an agent right away and he's going to say he'll test the process and get good feedback. But I don't see any situation where he comes back. And I think a guy like Aaron Henry could test the process as well, just because of that. You saw the ability that he showed, the consistency, but there's still there's mechanical things with his jump shot I think that he needs to work on. I think the motor needs to dial up more consistently. I think that he needs to become a better rebounder. I think he needs to have kind of a breakthrough season, kind of like Tillman had this year. But I think, the way that the systems is now, the way the system was last year, who knows what the system's going to be like this year. I think you test the process, but at this point, though, with all the uncertainty of, will there be a combine? Will there be a combine process? Will there be a pre-draft workout process? I mean, a lot of that stuff is fluid. So I'm kind of hesitant to say that. Now, the other guy I think is going to be interesting in that respect as well is Joshua Langford. You're talking about a guy who's coming off a second foot surgery. There was questions whether or not he would be able to play basketball again. They think that this surgery that he had in December corrected the blood flow problem to his left foot. So it'll be interesting to see, because he's a guy that, you talk about this whole roster the last 2 years. He's the only McDonald's All-American on that. And, he looked like a McDonald's All-American before that foot injury in the 2018-2019 season. And then he gets hurt. So, you wonder what the lateral movement's going to be like. You wonder what the propensity for more injury will be like. You wonder what his thought process will be in terms of, my window might be limited to play pro. Do I want to risk another injury in college? But then you also have to take into account how many opportunities are there going to be overseas now? Are there going to be opportunities overseas? Or are there going to be guys that are just stuck, fighting for all those G League spots and travel restrictions for people go? I mean, there's so much unknown that the other thing too is if he goes overseas, what kind of medical treatment will he get versus medical treatment here to try and get to his ultimate goal of being in the NBA? So I think Langford is going to be an interesting situation. And, when you look at that plays with the scholarship numbers right now. They've got two guys coming in, and A.J. Hogger, who's kind of a combo guard from Pennsylvania. He's at Huntington Prep. And then Matty Sissoko, who's, I believe he is from Mali, and he is 6'10", kind of big body, shot blocker, run the paint, and run in transition kind of guy that could be a nice addition for this team next year with his length and size. But they have an open spot, so does that go to Langford? Do guys leave? I mean, there's a lot I think that's going to be up in the air, and that's why when you see those way too early projection, I think there's still so much that needs to be determined with this roster going into next year.
The Spartans always find a way. This is their third Big Ten regular season championship in a row. You mentioned the guys coming in. Sissoko looks like the typical Michigan State big, 6'9", 230, 6'10", is going to run the floor. Hoggard also third best player in West Virginia. And of course, Joey Hauser, right? So Joey Hauser will be eligible too.
Biggest addition.
I think they're going to have a lot more players back because of what you said, the uncertainty of the draft. People aren't going to be able to get a read. Why not come back, play for one of the best coaches in the history of basketball, reload, and go back at it again? But yeah, I think Hauser's going to really help them.
No, absolutely. And I think that he was maybe the missing ingredient from this team doing some even more special things this year. And I still think they were on the path to doing it. But that 4 spot was one where they hadn't been able to find any consistency. I mean, Marcus Bingham struggled, but showed flashes. Thomas Kithier had showed flashes, but struggled. Hall finally kind of seized the job a little bit and showed some promise and potential. And then you look at Julius Marble, who looks like he's going to be a solid, sturdy 4-year guy, but didn't quite get the minutes to kind of blossom. But Hauser, had he been there, would have been the guy. I mean, he would have been a 30-plus minute a game player. So now you get him in next year. That helps alleviate some of the loss if Tillman does decide to go, which, like I said, I think that's just a matter of time for an announcement on that. So, and then you got to find a point guard. Foster Loyer has struggled. I think his lack of size and speed and lateral quickness, I think that has affected what Izzo has tried to do with the backup spot. Rocket Watts could play it, but we saw what he can do off the ball this year, as the two and attacking the lane down the stretch. I think that he was almost unguardable at times, very, very Keith Appling-like. I think there was, so he could move him to the 1 or keep him as kind of the combo guy and try and go after another guard. The name that really has come up a lot is Kareem Maine, trying to lure him from Canada. And I talked to his high school coach, and he thinks there would be a very good fit there, but that's all on Kareem Maine and what his determination and decision process is. He was supposed to visit Michigan State this week, which obviously got canceled when all in-home or all in-campus and in-person recruiting was shut down, and then they shut down the borders to Canada and U.S., so couldn't go meet him somewhere else either. So kind of a weird time here if you're trying to recruit one or two more pieces for the next year.
It certainly is. It's like a jigsaw puzzle that we know that Izzo's going to find a way to put together. Folks, Chris Solari, he writes for Detroit Free Press, one of the best in the business, covers basketball and football for them out at Michigan State. Follow him on Twitter at Chris Solari, Solari. Chris, man, stay safe, you and the family as well, and the kids. It was great to take a moment here, take a little bit of time, sort of get away, take an escape back into college basketball. We're looking forward to it, getting started up again next year. And this time next year, enjoying some March Madness with the Spartans for sure. Thanks so much for joining us.
You got it, Mike. Anytime, and glad to join you.